Thank you for following my advertorial. I'm going to try and keep it down to 20 minutes on that clock so we can have enough time to discuss. I've been told that this is being videoed, so I won't be making all the comments and jokes I intend to make when we move to Chatham House rules, because some of the stories I'm not allowed to tell in public, but they're the most important ones, so we'll get to that. This presentation used to be called Why Muddling Through Won't Do, but then I found out it's a very English expression, so I call it Systemic Approach to Change. Muddling through is what the head of the civil service in the UK once said how the UK government worked. We just muddle through. And the basic thesis here is if you're trying to solve something as big and difficult as climate change and development and resilience issues around resource security, muddling through is not just wandering through, trying to solve problems as they come up is not an appropriate way of achieving your outcomes. So that's a central thesis. But most places and most organizations work by muddling through. And this is my background because it's quite important to explain, kind of give some quantity to what I'm saying. E3G is a non-profit. We work across Europe, US, and China. And we work in a lot of areas: energy, climate change, development, security, diplomacy. My background, I worked in the UK Prime Minister's Strategy Group. I was in charge of climate change, energy, and international security policy. I also worked in the Foreign Office, and I have a background in industry. So all of what you're hearing today is not based on reading books, and it's not based on theory. It's based on the practice of working inside and outside government to try and drive change. And I've got 3 points. As all speeches should have 3 points. One is we need better ways of driving both policy and political change to achieve our goals. Secondly, the barriers to change are not primarily economic, technical, or analytical, but political and institutional. And thirdly, that we can find new approaches to accelerate and better direct change, but this is as much about things like innovation, design, and new skills as it is about new analysis. And being sitting in examination halls, the type of knowledge you test in an examination hall, we have quite good systems for producing. We do not have such good systems for the other pieces, which in my experience are equally, if not more important, in terms of solving this problem. And so all the way through, a lot of this is thinking about how do we change the operating system, the fundamental way we do things to achieve these outcomes. I'm going to do 4 things. Firstly, a brief discussion about what real decision-making looks like in real governments. And as my time in a strategy unit, I worked with particularly Prime Minister's units from across the world, developed and developing. I can assure you that no matter what country and no matter what culture, from the Chinese Communist Party to the National Security Council of the US, all bureaucracies are the same. It's one of the fundamentally good things. We can use models that work across all these cultures. They have the same dynamics inside them, expressed in slightly different ways, but they're all the same. Second, I'm going to go through some of the techniques we use for driving intentional change, apply them to a couple of examples from our current work on low carbon zones in China and the UK Green Investment Bank, and then kind of finish off with some of the areas I think really require attention, and one big idea we might perhaps discuss for the Action Lab. So the reality of decision-making, John Maynard Keynes, most famous British economist, there is nothing a government hates more than to be well-informed, for it makes the process of arriving at decisions so much more complicated and difficult. Never think a decision-maker wants you to come in with your 80-page report. You just make their life horrible. I have worked and advised decision-makers for years, and I know their faces drop when you come in and say, look at this wonderful piece of knowledge. Understand what it looks like from the decision-maker's point of view when you're asking them to do something. So, we know what we need to do. We know that we need to, with the resource constraints and risks, we know those. We know that preventative, transboundary, cooperative approaches are needed. We've known that for years. And we know most of these things are cost-effective. We know, despite all the speeches and the conferences, we're far away from meeting the goals. And we know the barriers are primarily political and institutional. That's because our systems for delivering technology and economic change, the finance markets, the science system, the engineering systems, are so much stronger than the profession which we don't have for driving institutional change, not in the usual way, which is the old people die off or leave and new people come in to replace them, but within the lifetime of a set of decision makers. Because the core decisions on climate change, resilience, resource scarcity are going to be made by the cadre of decision makers who are now entering their late 30s, early 40s. We haven't got more than 20 to 25 years to solve these problems, and that cadre, who have already done their education based on a previous worldview and already settled in their thoughts, are the people there. So unless we can change the institutions as they are, probably without fundamental revolution in most cases, though there could be some revolutions that are needed in some areas, we won't solve this problem. And those are quite formidable constraints. It's not enough to hope that new people emerge or we can educate the next generation or the generation before that. It's too late. We've got to think about the constraints on what we do. And the constraints on who we are. This is a quote from the Lord of Siena to Machiavelli, a policy advisor that we all admire. Wishing to make as few mistakes as possible, I conduct my government day by day and arrange my affairs hour by hour because the times are more powerful than our brains. There's a bit of humility here. The world is a very complex and difficult place. Most analysis is extremely flimsy and thin compared to the complexity of the world. And many decision makers see that. They look at it and go, that does not reflect the world I live in. And they reject it. Oh. They also should turn off their phones. There we are. Dealing with uncertainty. So we need to understand the real constraints on decision makers, not just assume they're either stupid, which I often hear, or that they lack this thing called political will, which is a massive black box we put everything into, which we don't like about how real decision makers work. And a lot of what we do is try and unpack that to work out what precisely they are not liking about the propositions we are putting to them. Because unless we all want to become politicians or go up the line and become decision makers, it's beholden to us to understand how our propositions are held by them, because they have legitimacy and authority, rather than sit there and complain. And I've been in many conferences where people say, Nick, but they haven't listened to us for 30 years. What's wrong with them? Perhaps you should think about what's wrong with what you're saying, as opposed to what's wrong with how they're listening. And it's usually a combination of both, but I think, again, and this is some of my favorite sustainable development things. So sustainable development, what we say and what they hear. Coherence is what we say. Policy should be coherent. What they hear is, my God, we have enough problems agreeing what to do internally without involving other people. It's hard enough getting along. Long-term approaches, we must think long-term. Day-to-day, it's hard enough keeping afloat day-to-day, keeping the electricity supply going. How can we possibly think further forward? Managing uncertainty. You should understand uncertainty, and here's more uncertainty to manage. It's like, I can't manage the uncertainty I've got. It's not helpful. It's not helping me make decisions, back to Keynes. So all these things, this is how the tropes of the sustainable development field appear to decision makers. You're not helping them make decisions in this way. Okay, that's the understand how decision makers see this stuff. How do we help them? It ain't what we do, it's the way that we do it, and that's what gets results. Funboy 3, good band, 1980s. Great philosophers of change. This is not about aiming for different things. It's about doing the process of change differently. And firstly, we need to build a compelling change. Very simple thing. If I'm going to make a compelling case for change, I need a why, a what, and a how. What's the case for action? What's the action needed? How should organizations respond? And you need to think about whether you've got that and who you're working with, who has authority across those. E3G, we do some whats, but lots of experts do whats. We work a lot on the why, which is politics, and the how, which is the dirty process of organizational practical change. But we know we need to have a coalition and a group of people who have all of those pieces in place in order to actually move things forward. And often one of the problems is you're missing one. I've got a great idea, it's a great policy. You can't explain why it's good. To the people who matter. Because that's dirty, they should just understand. It's so brilliant, I'm an advocate. Or, oh, it's brilliant, but you get to the how, and it's so complicated. The system you're trying to make work can never run a policy that difficult and complicated. I know, I've recommended policies that difficult and complicated and seen them crash and burn in the reality of implementation. Very useful lesson to learn. So what we call this is designing the policy and the politics together. Designing the politics means bring the necessary decision makers together, focus and frame their choices, define decision points and opportunities. When are you going to make decisions is as important. For the most important thing in dealing with these. And then building and animating winning coalitions. Ask yourself the question, who do I need to be on side to win this debate? To win a supergrid in Europe at the moment, or low carbon zones in China. Who needs to agree with me? And then work out how you get them in. And then you should have to do the policy alongside it, yeah. Analysis, research, institutional solutions, assembling the necessary resources. But we come down to one thing, one little phrase. The right people, in the right place, at the right time, with the right choices, in the right context. And if you can't answer those questions, you have not got a plan for change. Very simple thing. These are simple institutions you're trying to deal with people who are actually quite simple in the sense that they make lots and lots and lots of decisions. And these simple questions cut through the complexity. And we turn this into a tool we use, which I call the change framework. So we start a strategic outcome we define, spend a lot of time thinking about what is the outcome we want. Because most people we work with a lot of advisory work, when we say, well, what do you want to achieve? And then we actually sit their teams down and work through it. They'll have 20 answers, many of which are incompatible. So that's the core issue. Then we map the politics. Who needs to be in there? What is it? This is offline. We don't go out and talk to people at this stage, except in a kind of very open way, not targeted way. We map the politics. We do what lots of people do. We generate policy options. That's important. Iterating those together, we come up with a set of propositions. 5 or 6 or 7 things which may get us to our outcome or contribute to that process. We don't know which one's going to work. We've mapped the space pretty well, and we know the economics and the technical stuff pretty well, but we still don't know what's going to work because we're still offline. We're still sitting in a corner thinking offline. The next stage is the most important one, taking those propositions out into the real world and trying to build coalitions around them. Do these motivate people? Do these inspire the people who we need to make change to grab and say, that's an idea I want to pursue? Do they become the focus around which we can build a coalition or coalitions? And testing and refining the proposition online, in real political debate, in real policy debate, is critical because people don't give you answers unless you go there. And equally critical, but often underlooked, is that the kind of policy stuff you do in the first stage is pretty kindergarten stuff compared to actually doing real institutional change. And you need to deepen. So when I'm writing something to write a bill to set up a green investment bank, an idea we came up with 2 years ago, and the depth we're having to go into now to kind of nitty-gritty issues like the Consumer Credit Act and dull things like government accounting, so much more deep. But you need to get that right because so many times things are killed in some of those issues. And eventually we end up with a decision. And we have to map that decision. Who's there? What are they doing? So that's what we use to plan our interventions. And there's 5 competencies. We need strategic thinking, coalition building, thought leadership and agenda setting, organizational change, policy tool, knowledge development, and they rather beautifully map onto the policy framework like this. You don't have to have all of them, but if you have friends who have some of them, but you do need all of them if you're going to maximize the probability of change, and of course never think that this is linear because there's always a lot of luck involved. All of our great victories have had a bit of serendipity, usually right at the end in the senior decision-making process, which from off camera I'm happy to describe. And the way we see this happening is you start with a fragmented decision landscape usually. You then build your strategic outcome by building coalitions, trying to tunnel through between institutional barriers. You're kind of basically lashing up a decision, a difficult decision to make institutions work. But what you're really hoping to do is to drive institutional change and building so they can carry on making decision after decision after decision after decision. These things are never over. And again, if you're driving from a CDKN kind of outcome, you need to be looking at how do I drive those institutions. Some examples from E3G's work, quickly. Low carbon zones in China. 2 quotes from the Chinese leadership. I think the Chinese leadership is serious about climate change, perhaps not 2 degrees of climate change, might be serious about keeping it to 3 or 4 degrees, but they are serious for lots of reasons. But China faces huge challenges. It's relatively poor. It uses a huge amount of steel cement. It's building cities, it's building infrastructure, and its new construction between now and 2020 will exceed the whole building stock of the EU15, just to put it in proportion. So the core issue is how do you combine rapid urbanization, industrialization, and poverty reduction with the transition to a low-carbon economy? And this is what Chinese leadership asks itself. Is it possible, keeping to our development goals? This is climate-compatible development, if you want to call it. No country has ever done it at this stage of development. And we talked to the Chinese for 5 years, and their thing was, oh, we'll wait till you've done it and we'll copy. We're saying, no, Sweden's never going to give you a model for how to build a 2 million person city within 5 years in a low-carbon way, because we're just not pouring the concrete like you are. And we're at a different stage of development. You will have to innovate yourselves. First barrier. They did not feel it was legitimate to ask China to innovate in this area because of the structure of the dialogue on climate change. It's your responsibility, but you're asking us to innovate? Yep, because you're going to face the consequences. And we will not be innovating for you. We're not the right-shaped economies in the north. That was a huge hurdle. It was overcome, actually, by saying, actually, it's not you innovating to solve climate change. It's you innovating to go up the value chain and move to being a middle-income country while you've got a declining workforce. Because actually, our biggest allies were the modernizers in the Chinese Economic Planning Department. Our biggest enemies were the Climate Change Department in the Chinese Planning Department. And they won't watch the video, so I can say that. I hope. If I don't get a visa next time I go to Beijing, you know that someone's been listening. So the idea we came up with was low carbon zones with our partners So large-scale regions committed to low-carbon transformation, a place you can test and innovate, an integrated approach in linking production and consumption, not just pretty high-tech buildings sitting on a field with no services or industry around them, driven by Chinese leadership and supported by international cooperation to maximize areas and maximize the value of public funding. It emerged as a tree outcome of a research project with Chinese researchers. It was a critical insight that we needed better local governance to drive things like building and infrastructure change, and therefore we needed strong local leadership, and we needed to create a structure that incentivized leadership. The people who set up the special economic zones in China all got onto the state council. So we saw this as ways of incentivizing regional leaders that if they did this right, they may get promoted. Very simple piece of political alignment. And they had this model of special economic zones that has a very positive narrative in China and meant they really quickly picked up on it as a kind of, yes, we'll do this. So that's where we thought it is. And just on the change framework, so our original outcome was accelerating a move to a low-carbon economy in China. We did a lot of work, high-level work with decision makers and a stakeholder group between the EU and China to understand the politics with this big research process with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and Chatham House. And out of this came a load of areas, including low-carbon zones, but they were only one proposition. As soon as we started testing those with the EU-China summit process and with our stakeholders in China, low-carbon zones came out very strongly as the front runner. So we worked with others again, 5 pilots in real places in China, supported by the Chinese government, 3 technology zone studies, and the outcome is the Chinese government have announced 12 zones covering around 350 million people. That's only the first door. Now we'll see how they work and how we move to implement them, but it was that kind of a process. Again, UK low-carbon economy. This is the real low-carbon economy roadmap for the UK. However, it is adapted from a slide I did in 2003 when I was in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. So just to show there is a relationship between theory and practice, but that's a 8-year process, which says by 2020 we're going to have all new buildings zero carbon, that's a policy. All new power stations zero carbon, that's nearly a policy. By 2030 we'll have a zero carbon power sector, that is a policy now, or just about to go through policy in the UK. A zero carbon building sector, that is policy. 2040, a low carbon transport sector, 80% reductions, nearly a policy, kind of half there. And then everything else is pushed off to 2050 because it's too hard. Notice that that's agriculture, industry, aviation. Things are very high interest to developing countries, but areas that developed countries can push off because the constituencies around those are too difficult to tackle early on. The reason why we tackle the power sector is it's an easier job to solve politically as well as giving us more options technically. But what does that need? It means £1 trillion of investment to 2030 in the UK. Unfortunately, in markets driven by politics, whether the politics of climate change or the politics of the oil price, lots of new business models, energy services, etc. Early stage markets, unattractive. So the answer is most private investors are not investing. Our problem is we can't get, it doesn't matter what we do with the price. They're not investing. I'm going to fix over. So what did we do to deal with this issue? The prices worked, but people weren't investing because the risk is too high. So we promoted an idea with partners of the Green Investment Bank, government finance bank for delivering a low carbon transition. 4 things it does. New funds, taking funds from pension funds into low carbon via green bonds, risk management, aggregator of projects, advisor to government, so they set policy right to do this. And we thought it needed around £4 to £6 billion to leverage 150 to 300 billion in investment. That's lots of numbers around that. So again, the change framework. We want to deliver low carbon investment. We had a lot of political engagement with the government and the Treasury around what the politics were of this. It's all about government debt. It's not about climate change. It's about debt, growth, investment. We set up a multi-stakeholder green recovery group that came up with a set of issues, including a green investment bank, green bonds, green stimulus as ideas. We worked with the political parties. We got the Conservative Party support fundamentally, which meant the Labour Party was in government, had to support it. We ended up with a fight between the political parties over who had the biggest green bank proposition. And we set up a new coalition of industries and bankers called Transform UK. We worked very hard to design it and show it was doable and analyse what was needed. Again, working with the finance sector. And in principle, the current coalition government announced in May last year, and we just had £3 billion in equity given to the bank and the right to borrow set up this March, and it should be established by 2012. So again, you can see it kind of complicated through there, but a stream of change. So the basic thing is, if you're going to do change, you have to stop seeing the politics and those pieces of institutional change as spin or a black box. They are intrinsically part of delivering the wonderful ideas you get from analysis. And so often we work with organizations where analysis is prized and everything else is seen as communications or somehow dirty and horrible. No, this stuff is rational in its own lovely way. You can analyze it, you can pull it apart, you can apply lots of very complicated techniques. You want complicated techniques, I can do complicated techniques with you. But fundamentally, you can plan to increase the probability of change through a set of techniques. I'm not going to go through these, but we think there are huge areas which need just linking together government's energy and climate security policies. Really important. Finance, we've gone through innovation policy, completely bust in this area in all countries. And how do we get more innovation systems, better innovation systems in developing countries who have different innovation challenges to developed countries where most innovation is currently done? And we see we're looking at ideas of development analogues where, say, a piece of China which can invest in innovation, models and works up models that can be used in Africa and India and other places. So how do we get those connections? What people often call South-South, which I think is kind of rather patronizing way of talking about it. It's about development analogues. Where are the best places to do innovation? And how security and development and climate change policy fits together. Final piece of wisdom, not from me, simplicity, not simplistic. I wouldn't give a fig for simplicity this side of complexity. However, I give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity. Just because you're clever. We're all clever in this room. This is a very clever place, Oxford. That's not the point. The point is, as I keep on being bullied by my other co-founder of E3G, don't try and win the argument, Nick. Try and win the outcome. And if that means you might actually have to look like you've lost the argument, chill. Focus on making things simple enough that they can actually work, as opposed to sitting there going, I told you so t-shirts. They're not very, I've got a lot of them, and they're not very satisfying. Really not actually sit there going, we told them that would happen. Well, yeah, great. I was in government, I told them it would happen, they didn't listen. Something really bad happened that affected real people. That doesn't make me feel good. It makes me feel I've failed in my job. And so a lot of this comes out of that. So one big idea just to leave on for Action Lab. We think that we need to develop a high-level route map for practitioners, like that little kind of route map I had for the UK, but something very high level, of critical political decision areas beyond this climate-compatible planning or low-carbon planning that is the kind of fashion du jour at the moment. Lots of PowerPoints at Prime Minister's office levels. I've done a lot of that. And we think that should be based on experience, understanding all the other top-down poverty reduction strategy papers, sustainable development reviews, all the things we've done before. We've learned a lot of how not to do it. Let's make sure we learn from that. Because I see too many people in this space who know about climate change but don't know about the last 20 or 30 years of development planning, which just drives me crazy at the waste of money that will cause. And that we end up with using that as a guide to prototype in the field in 4 or 5 countries, an end-to-end process that takes us from this plan stage actually delivering some real change processes. We've been talking to people about budget transparency. How do you look at accountability of all this money flowing into economies? We're talking about radical change to power sectors, looking at the incumbents and how finance flows and regulation flows. Real meaty economic regulation, public regulation areas, not projects, not even programs, but areas of change, which you could actually drive through in several places so people can learn. Because I'll come back to my first point. We need to learn faster if we're going to solve this problem. So we need to innovate faster, prototype faster, learn the lessons faster, and replicate and scale faster. Otherwise, we're kidding ourselves that we've even got a chance of solving this problem at the scale we need to do it. Thanks.